Jared Whitman had always believed that running a restaurant empire was just a complex game of strategy, like chess, only with profit margins. From his 21st floor office with its pristine glass walls and panoramic view of the city skyline, everything looked neat, predictable, under control. He reviewed spreadsheets, approved budgets, and signed off on executive memos with sharp efficiency. No room for sentiment, no distractions, but while he sat surrounded by silence and data, down below, in the heat of the kitchens, in the echoes of slammed pans and disgruntled customer complaints, something was quietly coming undone. The restaurant chain he had inherited from his late father wasn't just a business. It had once been a symbol of heart, of care, of purpose. His father had built it from the ground up, with bare hands and sleepless nights, pouring soul into every detail. From the seasoning on the fries to the way staff were trained to treat customers like family. Jared had expanded that dream, growing it into a 12-location enterprise, but for every location added, he had taken one step further away from the kitchens, one step further from the soul of what his father had built. And he hadn't noticed. Not until the warning signs started to whisper, not in numbers, but in the spaces between them. Customer feedback began flooding in, not about the food, but about the experience. Complaints about slow service, cold interactions, something intangible yet deeply unsettling, a kind of coldness that no spreadsheet could capture. At first, Jared brushed it off as growing pains, but the murmurs grew into patterns, the patterns into red flags, and soon those flags felt like flares in the night sky, urgent, undeniable. The final wake-up call came from an unexpected corner. Two district executives chatting casually in the office break room. The West Side stores are seriously understaffed. Yeah, I heard. The manager says it's just lazy kids who don't want to work anymore. You buying that? Not really. Jared froze outside the door. It felt like overhearing someone say your child was starving and realizing they were right and you hadn't even noticed. That day, he finally saw the truth. He had become the kind of CEO who ruled from a distance, so far removed that he no longer knew what was happening in his own house. He didn't hesitate. Jared stepped down from his high-rise office and made a decision that no one in the company saw coming. He was going undercover, not as the man in charge, but as a new hire. A ghost, a name on a name tag. He chopped his hair, picked up a basic uniform from a supplier, and gave himself a new identity. Jared Walker. His target? A notoriously busy location on the outskirts of Chicago, a store he had never set foot in. No one there knew his face. That was the point. The moment he stepped inside, the air hit him like a wall, a thick mix of grease, heat, and tension. The kitchen was chaos, voices shouting over sizzling fryers, orders piling up, machines buzzing without rhythm. In the dining area, two servers darted between tables, visibly overwhelmed. Jared didn't need a report to know this place was running on fumes. It wasn't even 1 p.m., and yet every employee moved like they were at the end of a 14-hour shift. He looked into their eyes and saw exhaustion that had settled into their bones. Not from one bad day, from weeks, maybe months. Hey, you the new guy? A voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned and saw a young woman, maybe late 20s. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, uniform clean but faded from countless washes. The shadows beneath her eyes weren't from a single bad night. They were carved by habit, yet her tone wasn't bitter, just resigned. Yeah, I'm Jared. Tessa. I'll show you around, but just a heads up, around here it's sink or swim, and no one has time to throw you a life vest. She didn't smile, but she wasn't cruel either. There was something steady about her, something holding it all together, even as everything around her threatened to fall apart. As Jared followed her through the narrow back aisles and past the chaos of the grill line, he started to realize something. Tessa wasn't just another employee. She was the backbone. She worked fast, sharp, with muscle memory forged from repetition and necessity. She stayed polite with customers even when they snapped. She cleaned up mistakes that weren't hers, and she never lost her cool, though Jared saw, in moments when she thought no one was watching, that her hands trembled. One customer yelled about a missing side order, clearly something the kitchen messed up. Still, Tessa apologized, smiled gently, and fixed it without a word of complaint. Jared saw it in her eyes then, a flicker of pain, a flicker of weariness, like a candle trying not to go out in the wind. During her short break, she checked her phone quickly, frowning as she read something on the screen. Her face tightened, just for a second, but it was enough to hint at a private burden, something she carried alone. She slipped the phone away like it burned. And then he saw Kevin. The store manager strolled out of the office like he owned the world. Expensive watch gleaming, shirt perfectly pressed. His energy clashed with the grit of the workers around him. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how things were. Instead, he barked across the floor. "Tessa, table 5's been waiting. Move." She flinched slightly, but didn't protest, just nodded and walked away. Jared felt something clench in his gut. How could someone like Kevin treat his people like this? How could he stand back while his team was drowning? Jared began to watch more closely. Kevin barely stepped onto the floor. He stayed holed up in the office most of the time, only appearing to scold. He didn't lift a finger to help. He didn't offer support. He was a shadow, one that grew darker every time he opened his mouth. Meanwhile, the restaurant ran on desperation. The kitchen was short-staffed. Servers were juggling dishes, registers, refills, complaints, all while trying to stay human. Tessa wasn't a supervisor, didn't have a title, but she was holding the whole thing together by sheer willpower. By 6 p.m., her face had lost all color, her steps had slowed. Her hand trembled as she placed a glass of water on a table. Jared moved toward her, gently. "You doing okay?" She looked at him, and for one brief, unguarded moment, all the layers of strength she wore like armor fell away. The exhaustion, the stress, the quiet, lonely war of someone fighting battles no one else could see. And the worst part? She'd gotten used to it. Tessa let out a faint laugh, shaking her head, but the small smile on her lips couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes, dull and clouded from being pushed too far for too long. "I'm fine. Just a long day," she said softly, the words barely carrying weight, like a leaf floating through a storm. But Jared could see it clearly now. This wasn't just end-of-shift fatigue. It was deeper. It was the slow, quiet erosion of someone trying to survive in silence, peace. His chance to understand her better came moments later, when Kevin stepped out of the office again, wearing the same annoyed expression, as if being asked to engage with his staff was a personal inconvenience. "Tessa, your shift ended over an hour ago," he said, not even bothering to look at her. "Why are you still here?" Tessa hesitated, as if weighing honesty against self-preservation. "We're short-staffed," she said quietly. "I didn't want to leave everyone hanging during the rush." Kevin scoffed, his tone cold and dismissive. "Not my problem. Clock out and go home." Jared waited for her to push back, to defend herself, but she didn't. She simply nodded, grabbed her bag, and walked out without a word. Something wasn't right. No one who needed the money would voluntarily give up extra hours. That kind of silent compliance wasn't laziness, it was fear. And it stabbed Jared right in the chest. He watched her leave, her figure shrinking into the night, and made a decision. He needed to get to the bottom of this. This wasn't just one busy location. This was a broken system, suffocating under negligent leadership. And Kevin, the man meant to guide and support his staff, was the very one pressing them down. Back inside, the restaurant's pace hadn't slowed. Order tickets kept printing non-stop, customers were growing restless, and the staff ran around, barely staying afloat. In the kitchen, the crew didn't even have time to wipe down their stations before the next wave of orders came crashing in. Jared jumped behind the grill to help. He learned fast, so fast that the older cook next to him, a man named Lewis, gave a surprised grunt. "You pick things up quick," Lewis said, flipping a patty. "Wish we had more like you." But his voice wasn't encouraging. It was tired, resigned, like someone who had hoped for better too many times and now only knew disappointment. Jared glanced at him, trying to keep the conversation light. "Are you always this short-staffed?" Lewis didn't look up. He just gave a weary shrug and muttered, "Always. Kevin says we don't have the budget for more staff. Funny though, never seen him cut back his own hours." That line struck Jared like a match. The place was clearly making money. Customers kept pouring in, orders kept flying out, but the people doing the real work were being pushed to their limits, and Kevin? He was holed up in an office, untouched by the chaos. That night, after his shift ended, Jared didn't head home. He stayed in the parking lot, leaning against a post, watching as the staff trickled out one by one. He spotted Tessa across the lot, slumped against an old beat-up sedan, her hands rubbing her temples like she was trying to hold herself together. She pulled out her phone, hesitated, then made a call. Jared couldn't hear what was being said, but her body said enough. Her shoulders tensed, her eyes darkened, and when she finally hung up, she exhaled sharply, like she'd just taken a hit straight to the chest. This wasn't just about the job. Something heavier was weighing her down. The next morning, Jared returned early, hoping to learn more. As he approached the back entrance, he heard voices through the slightly ajar door. Kevin's voice, sharp and slicing. "I don't care if you're behind on rent. You left your shift early yesterday. That's not acceptable." Jared froze outside, every muscle in his body tensing. "I stayed an extra hour," Tessa replied, her voice calm but trembling. "You left when I told you to leave," Kevin snapped. "If you want more hours, ask for them. That's how this works." There was a pause. Then Tessa said, softer now, "I asked last week. You cut my hours anyway." Kevin let out a mocking laugh. "Not my problem. If you want more hours, earn them." Jared clenched his fists. This wasn't just poor management. This was manipulation. Kevin was using this schedule as a tool to control his staff, rewarding submission, punishing resistance. The morning shift began as usual, but for Jared, nothing felt normal anymore. He watched every interaction with fresh clarity. Kevin didn't help when things got hectic. He only showed up to criticize. If someone made a mistake, he called them out in front of others. If someone worked hard, he ignored it. During a rare lull, Jared found Tessa in the storage room, restocking spices. Her posture was slouched, like the weight of the world was on her back. He approached slowly. "I overheard what Kevin said to you this morning," Jared began, keeping his voice steady. She didn't look at him. "It's fine. Just work." "It doesn't seem like just work," he replied. "It seems like he's cutting your hours on purpose." She paused, then slowly set down the box in her hands and sighed. "He has favorites, and if you don't play along, you lose shifts. Simple as that." "Why don't you just quit?" Jared asked, not out of curiosity this time, but from a place of quiet heartbreak. Tessa gave a half smile, the kind that hurt more than it comforted. "Because rent doesn't wait, and jobs don't exactly fall out of the sky." Jared nodded. He understood. This wasn't just a job. It was survival, a brutal trade-off between dignity and a roof over your head. That evening, the final straw came. Maria, a single mother working the night shift, was moving quickly from table to table, doing her best but checking her phone every few minutes. When Kevin noticed, he called her out across the room. "You texting all night, Maria? Or should I just cut your hours now?" her face flushed red. "My sitter's running late." Kevin waved her off like she was an inconvenience. "Not my problem." Jared went still. There was no room left for doubt. This wasn't bad management. This was exploitation, calculated and deliberate. A system designed to run on fear. By the end of the shift, Jared had made up his mind. He wouldn't wait another day. Tonight, Kevin was going to find out exactly who he'd been belittling and ignoring all this time. When the last customers had gone and the restaurant was quiet, Jared stayed behind. Tessa and Maria silently wiped down tables, their eyes glassy with exhaustion, but their hands still moving. Kevin, as always, was in his office, eyes glued to his phone like nothing outside that screen mattered. No one knew it yet, but a storm was waiting just outside the door. While everyone else continued doing the work Kevin should have been overseeing, Jared walked toward the office. He knocked once, then pushed the door open. Kevin didn't even look up. "You need something?" he mumbled, not bothering to lift his eyes from the screen. Jared stepped inside and shut the door behind him. He took off the cheap employee cap, ran a hand through his hair, and looked Kevin square in the eyes, his expression calm, but razor-sharp. "Yeah," Jared said. "I need you to understand who you've been talking down to for the last 2 days." Kevin frowned, clearly confused. He hadn't recognized him, not in that discount uniform. That had been his mistake. Jared let the silence hang for a beat, then spoke. "My name is Jared Whitman. I own this entire restaurant chain." At first, Kevin didn't react. Maybe he thought it was a joke. But slowly, his face paled. His spine stiffened, as if ice water had been poured down his back. "That's a funny one," Kevin muttered, though his voice already betrayed him. Jared didn't argue. He simply pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, and held it up. The company's website, logo front and center, his name clearly displayed under founder and CEO. Kevin's eyes darted between the screen and Jared's face. His breath caught in his throat. Jared took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "I've spent the last 2 days watching how you run this place. How you overwork your team, ignore their struggles, and pretend not to see them drowning. That ends now." Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but Jared cut him off, his tone sharper now. "I saw you cut Tessa's hours even though she's the one keeping this place from falling apart. I saw you humiliate Maria in front of everyone just because she was trying to make sure her kid was safe. I saw an entire team give everything they had while you sat in this office doing nothing." Kevin gripped the armrests of his chair, his last defense. "You don't understand how hard it is to manage a place like this. Sometimes employees need tough leadership." "That's not leadership," Jared snapped, eyes flashing. "That's control, and you crossed the line." Kevin's voice cracked. "Wait, are you saying—" "You're fired, effective immediately." Jared didn't raise his voice, but every word struck with finality. "Your severance will be reviewed, but don't expect much. Pack your things. You're not coming back." Kevin sat frozen, fists clenched, but he didn't argue. Maybe deep down, he knew there was nothing left to say. Jared turned and walked out without another word, exhaling slowly, like he too needed air after tearing off the rotten mask this place had been wearing for too long. Out in the dining area, Tessa, Maria, and a few others were wrapping up the final tasks of the night. Their faces were still tired, etched with long hours and harder days, but underneath that, there was something else. Numbness. The kind that comes after years of being used to unfairness. Jared stepped into the center of the room. He cleared his throat gently. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Everyone looked up. "Kevin's been fired." The silence was thick. Then slowly, expressions shifted, from disbelief to a cautious sort of hope. Maria blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Tessa let out a breath, rubbing the back of her neck like she'd just dropped a weight she'd been carrying for too long. "Really?" Tessa asked, her voice hesitant. Jared nodded. "As of right now." Lewis, the old cook, let out a low whistle. "Didn't think I'd live to see that day." Jared took a step forward, his voice steady but warmer now. "Starting today, things are going to change. No more playing favorites, no more punishing the hardest workers while the slackers skate by, and no more so-called leadership that only shows up when it's convenient." Tessa crossed her arms, eyes still guarded. "How do we know this isn't just talk?" Jared met her gaze without flinching. "Because I've worked beside you. I saw how hard you fight to keep this place running, how you plug every hole while the one who should have helped stood on the sidelines. That's why, starting today, you're being promoted to assistant manager." Her eyes widened. "Wait, what? What?" "You've already been doing the job," Jared said gently. "You just haven't had the title or the paycheck. Now you will." Maria let out a soft laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. Jared continued, his tone full of purpose. "We're going to adjust pay. We'll review the schedule to make sure everyone gets the hours they need. And when we bring in a new general manager, it'll be someone who actually supports this team, not someone who hides behind a door." For the first time since he'd stepped foot in this store, Jared saw something shift in their faces. Not just surprise, not even joy yet, but hope. The kind that had been buried under exhaustion for far too long. Tessa looked down, eyes shimmering. When she looked up again, her smile was real, soft, vulnerable. I don't know what to say." Jared returned the smile. "You don't need to say anything. Just show me what this place can be. When it's run the right way." He stepped back, giving them space. The same people who had been crushed under the weight of bad leadership were now starting to stand taller, move with purpose. They didn't smile fully, not yet, but they no longer walked with their heads down. And that was enough for now. Jared stood there, taking it all in, not as the boss, but as a man who had once gotten it wrong and was now trying to make it right. It would take time to heal what had been broken, but tonight, something had truly shifted. He knew real change didn't begin with promises. It began with action. Jared understood that, and he knew trust wasn't something you asked for. It had to be earned, slowly, patiently, consistently. Last night he had laid the first brick, but he wasn't naive enough to think that was enough. The next morning, Jared returned to the restaurant early, before the doors opened to customers. He was no longer Jared Walker, the guy in the cheap employee cap. He walked in as himself, not like a king reclaiming a throne, but like a man with a long road ahead and a responsibility he refused to ignore. The restaurant felt quiet, but different. Something had shifted. Employees moved through the space with a subtle hesitation, as if waiting to see whether the promises from the night before would evaporate like so many others had. It wasn't distrust. It was the survival instinct of people who had been let down too many times. Tessa was already behind the counter, flipping through the schedule and double-checking inventory. She looked up when she saw him, her expression unreadable. "Didn't think you'd be back this soon," she said, setting the clipboard down. Jared leaned casually against the counter, his tone calm but firm. "I made a promise. Disappearing right after wouldn't feel right." She nodded. It wasn't full trust, but it was something, the beginning of something. The rest of the staff began to arrive one by one, whispering quietly among themselves, sneaking glances at Jared, measuring their hope against the need to protect themselves. He knew exactly what they needed. Wasn't more speeches, it was follow through. So this time he didn't just watch, he stepped into the middle of the room and spoke with steady intention, his voice clear but never forceful. "I know last night may have been a lot. And I know after years under someone like Kevin, it's hard to believe anything real could change. But I'm not here to take over. I'm here to rebuild what should have never been broken. He paused, letting the words breathe. We're hiring more staff. No more running this place with half the team. Pay adjustments have already started, and from now on, if something's wrong, you tell me. No more decisions made in a closed office by someone who doesn't know what it's like out here on the floor. Louis, the seasoned cook with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many false starts, crossed his arms. And what if the next manager ends up just like Kevin? Jared met his gaze squarely. Then they'll be gone just as quickly. No one clapped. No one cheered. But heads slowly began to nod, not in celebration but in cautious relief, like people stepping onto an old bridge, praying this time it would hold. Throughout the morning shift, Jared didn't stand aside and observe. He jumped in like any other team member, taking orders, delivering food, helping in the kitchen, picking up what others didn't have time to. He didn't need to say he cared. They could see it in how he moved. Around mid-shift, while he was wiping down a table, Tessa approached him quietly. "You know this almost never happens, right?" she said, her tone no longer cold but thoughtful. "What doesn't?" Jared asked, drying his hands on a towel. "Owners working alongside their staff, most of them only show up when there's money to squeeze." He looked at her, sincere. "Maybe that's what needs to change." She let out a soft sigh. "I'm not saying everything's fixed, but this is the first time in a long time it feels like someone actually gives a damn. Just don't disappear when things start to feel normal again." Jared nodded. "I won't." By the end of the day, something was undeniably different. Steps were lighter. Eyes weren't glued to the floor. They hadn't fully believed yet, but for the first time in a long while, they wanted to. Before leaving, Jared paused alone in the middle of the room. The restaurant still needed work. Trust wasn't fully rebuilt, but after all these years, it finally felt like the place was moving in the right direction. And he wasn't going anywhere until it truly got there. The next morning, Jared returned again. This time, with no disguise. He walked in as himself, but with a heart that had changed. He wasn't the man in the ivory tower anymore. He was someone who had come down to the ground, ready to listen, ready to learn. Tessa was at the register entering orders into the system. When she saw him, she didn't look surprised. She simply said, "I thought your work here was done." He shrugged, smiling faintly. "Told you I wasn't disappearing." She nodded this time without hesitation. No more words needed. The morning crew moved with quiet focus. Maria was checking tables. Louis chopped onions at his station. Others prepped breakfast. The tension wasn't gone, but it had eased. They were no longer bracing for impact. They were preparing for purpose. Jared moved around the space, not hovering, just watching, noticing what was missing, what needed fixing. The biggest issue was still staffing. Without Kevin's restrictions, they could finally start hiring. But that would take time. By the lunch rush, Jared rolled up his sleeves again. Wherever there was a gap, he filled it. No one questioned it now. He wasn't a mystery anymore. He was part of the rhythm. When the pace slowed, Jared pulled Tessa aside. "We need to talk about hiring," he said. "Who do you trust to help us find the right people?" She thought for a moment. "Louis. He's been here the longest. He knows who works and who just talks a good game." Jared nodded. "Then Louis is part of the hiring process." Tessa crossed her arms. "What about the manager? You planning on bringing someone from the outside?" He had already considered this. "Only if we have to. I'd rather promote from within. If we've got someone ready, I'll back them." She didn't respond right away, but in her eyes Jared saw hope, quiet, cautious, but real. Absolutely. Here's the fluent and emotionally accurate American English translation of your provided content, adhering closely to the natural tone, grammar, and storytelling style of American narrative prose. Underscore, 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 underscore. Jared nodded. He didn't argue, didn't try to smooth things over with empty reassurance. He understood. In a world like this, someone like Maria didn't have the luxury of believing in promises. For her, trust couldn't be borrowed. It had to be built through consistency and proof. "I get it," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to believe me right away. Just keep doing what you do, and if something isn't right, tell me. Don't carry it alone." Maria studied him for a few moments, her eyes guarded, worn by past betrayals. Then she nodded. It wasn't surrender. It was a careful first step, like testing the ground in a place where too much had already collapsed. Night slowly crept in. The rhythm of the restaurant began to ease. The sounds of sizzling in the kitchen softened, replaced by the low hum of closing duties. Jared stepped back, saying nothing, simply watching. But what he saw this time wasn't hopeless fatigue. It was something else. Cooperation. Even though the team was still short-handed and the pressure remained high, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were adapting, backing each other up, solving problems instead of just reacting to them. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress. As the night shift wrapped up and the final cleanup began, Jared stood and watched. The scene before him felt like a mirror of what had once been broken, and now, brick by brick, breath by breath, was being rebuilt. He knew what had to come next. Hiring had to be the top priority. No team could sustain itself under constant staff shortages. But beyond that, what this restaurant and his entire company needed was a complete structural shift. Not just more people, but a return to what mattered, being heard, being supported, being empowered. They needed real training, clear two-way communication, and above all, leadership that protected its people, not one that ruled from above. At the end of the night, Jared locked the doors and stood outside, alone in the chill of the evening air. In the quiet, under the street lamp's dull glow, he felt the truth settle deep into his bones. This wasn't just about one restaurant. This was about an entire system that had once worked until it drifted off course. Not because of numbers, but because it lost touch with its heart. And he who once believed leadership was all about spreadsheets and performance metrics now knew better. Real leadership doesn't start in a boardroom. It starts on the line, in the heat of the kitchen, at tables sticky with syrup and coffee, in the weary eyes of workers who keep going even when no one's looking. Tomorrow, he'd return, not to supervise, but to walk with them. Because what they were rebuilding now wasn't just a store. It was a culture, and he wasn't going to let it fade into neglect ever again. And if you've ever felt like real change is just out of reach, subscribe to Moments of Quiet Truth, where every story is a reminder that sometimes lasting change begins with the quietest decision, from a heart that finally chose to speak.